Welcome to God with George Ortega and Joshua Bond. This is episode number 4. And unlike my other series where I would just record one episode each day because they were kind of like time related, this one, it doesn't really matter, whether we do 2 or 3 episodes in one day or not. So we're recording this immediately after we recorded the last one. It's on Monday, October 27th at now 2:48 p.m. Eastern time. And so Joshua, let's start us off. We just went through God as being the supreme being, the creator, the principal object of faith. Now we're on to, and again, we're on this wiki page of what we mean, the vast majority of us, when we talk of God. So again, the next entry is about omnipotence. God, Joshua, start us off.
All right, so is God all-powerful, right? And this starts to get into the more sticky parts because without getting into the other attributes, it conflicts. If God's all-powerful, then why did he create evil? Why is there evil and suffering, right? So we were having this discussion, and again, this is just a conversation between two friends to dive into all this, and we're not trying to convert anybody to any one religion. We don't even have the same views necessarily as each other. So we're just talking this out. And something that dawned on us when we were talking this out is maybe we have this misguided concept of what what all powerful means, right? And maybe it's more of a sense of anywhere there is power happening, anywhere there is action happening, right? That is God. All right. If there's nothing happening, there's nothing there. Is that still God? And is that such an important attribute of God? Should we focus and waste all the time fighting over, God's all powerful. Could he make a rock so big that he couldn't lift? Could he make laws that he couldn't control? These kinds of things. So for me personally, I find a lot of value in thinking about this attribute as anywhere anything is happening, any power is playing out, any causality, that is God. And that is an opportunity to understand God and God's nature better.
Right. That's a very important distinction. Sometimes people will define omnipotence, all powerfulness, as being able to do whatever God wants to do. And yes, we have to remember, and this isn't foreign to most religions. Basically, most religions understand and accept that God is constrained by God's nature. For example, if God is eternal, God can't suddenly stop existing because by his nature, God is eternal. If God made these principles, these mathematical principles, whereby 1 + 1 = 2, in this world that God created, 1 + 1 must equal 2. God cannot make 1 + 1 = 3. Another thing God can't do. So God, I don't think, according to how we understand God's laws of nature, God can't make time go in reverse. I mean, it's conceivable that God could decide to change the laws of nature, perhaps, and reverse time. But from our understanding, so Josh's point is very important. It's not, being all powerful does not mean that God can do anything God wants to do. God is simply, whatever happens, whatever has happened, we must attribute it completely to God and not to anything but God.
Yeah, George, people like to fight about this or worry about it, as if, well, maybe God could change the laws. And so maybe we need to have a different definition on it, but it doesn't seem that God does, right? So we would apply the same thing to anybody that we love and care about. So George might have an off day where he's acting weird, but, I'm going to reflect on George, how I know him, not 355 days of the year. And if I focus on, waste the rest of the year, the rest of my relationship with George, sacrifice or jeopardize it by, arguing about arbitrary phenomenon that we are, mortal, small, tiny creatures with small brains and aren't going to figure out, that's just a waste of time, right? And I think, this all-powerful concept, what we can see is, there's this law of entropy in physics and in chemistry, that everything will break down. This is in nature. This is, why trees and biology and we will ultimately decompose, right? But there is, this love that God put in the universe that defies this law of entropy, that lets biology come into being and and sprouted life. And through this life, we can have consciousness, we can know ourselves, we can know each other, have relationship, and from this comes love, this comes happiness, and even morality, all the things that we love in life.
Yeah, and relative to love and happiness, this understanding of God as all-powerful, omnipotent is just not, it's not just theoretical. It's not just knowing something to know it. As Joshua was mentioning, like, let's say one day, I totally weird out, just, start, it's like Joshua, who knows that God is in control, is not going to blame me for that. When we don't behave like we'd like to, when others don't behave like we'd like them to, it's very important for us to understand, for us to fully and deeply understand that it's not their doing. It's God compelling us to act however we do. Now, why is this important? Because and this is within the context of this free will issue that we'll eventually get into in detail because it's important. It relates to God. In other words, if God is all powerful, then we can't have a free will. So under this context where we're blaming ourselves, attributing what we do to ourselves, we are condemning ourselves, we're judging ourselves. And when we judge ourselves and each other, we want ourselves and each other punished and all. And it creates a lot of unnecessary adversity and harm and lack of love and lack of happiness. So this understanding that God is powerful, as Josh was saying, as I'm explaining also, is to help us create a more harmonious, happy, and virtuous world.
Certainly, George. And, again, even the free will issue, we like to nitpick and argue about it. And I don't care. I have strong convictions that free will is highly illusory. And we've been so misled, and the ego or the devil, or however you want to conceive it, has, misled us on that. But yet it doesn't matter to me because love trumps that, right? So, I don't care about these fine, detailed arguments. What I care about is, does my orientation to this body of knowledge and this revelation help make my life better and other people's lives better? And every time I look at it, every time I evaluate that and sit down, I come to this conclusion that right now, where we're at in history, where we're at in our abundance and our evolution of consciousness, understanding these illusions is the starting point, right? So understanding that we don't have a free will helps me ask myself and ask God, how can I not make that mistake again that hurts me or hurts myself? And how can I help others who are struggling with their own behavior and want to change, whether they're addicted or they're depressed or whatever it is, and maybe they don't want to change, but maybe they kind of know changing would be better for them, but they don't want to change, right? But so how can I help them with that? And so that they can get to the point where they do want to change, and then we can figure out how to change, and we can just end a whole lot of suffering and misery in the world. I can't think of a whole lot that could be more spiritual and worthwhile than that.
Excellent. And again, it's our perspective that understanding God, understanding and accepting God's nature will help us with our virtue and our happiness and, communicating. So, I wanted to relate this attribute of omnipotence to this idea. A lot of people in the world are either atheists, like here in the United States, I think about 10% of us are atheists, and another a percentage of us are agnostic. They're not really sure. And I think a lot of even strong quote unquote believers, they believe that there's a God, but they're not completely sure. They have faith that there's a God. They hope there's a God. And so what we want to do as part of this definition of God, the attributes of God, we want to explain how, if we're defining God as we're defining God, according to Wiki, according to the Bible really, then God isn't just a belief. God is a necessary reality. For example, with relation to omnipotence, well, we understand that there are the laws of nature. In physics, we understand the laws of let nature govern everything. We accept that. So in order to see the necessity of God, we just like have to understand that God is the laws of nature. If the laws of nature exist, God as omnipotent exists. And Josh, take us through, because like we went through the creator, if God is the creator, how does that, attribute of God also provide an irrefutable argument that God must necessarily exist, that God is not just a belief?
Yeah, like I talked about last time, I really appreciate how you tied in creator and the other attribute of being eternal. So God didn't just create and then he checked out, he's gone and we're on our own. That creation is still playing out and God is still creating. And this relates to being all powerful because, thinking power as in terms of being able to make something happen, right? Being able to cause something to happen, that is power, right? So anywhere this creation is playing out, anywhere creation of new events or new phenomenon or new cause and effect is playing out, that is a form of power. And I think that's, how I can relate and get the most out of these attributes.
Excellent. All right, so we'll probably come back to omnipotence because it relates to some of the other attributes. You'll see that we can derive, some attributes from others. For example, like let's just derive one. If God is the creator, if God created this world, then yes, that means that God is the governor, the ruler of this world. That, think about it. If you are everything, if you're eternal and you are everything and you create everything, how could you not be in control of everything? And again, we'll relate to this relative to omniscience and other attributes. But that's an important point to keep in mind. To say, okay, Josh, what's the next attribute we want to explore?
Omniscience, all-knowing. Is God omniscience? Is he all-knowing? What do you think, George?
Well, all right, going right back to this derivation thing. If God is the creation, if God created everything, there's nothing that exists that God didn't create. How could God not know everything? Again, we'll get to this when we get to omnipresence. If God is everything, if God is everywhere, how could God not know everything?
Yeah, I think it really comes back to that, deriving it from creator and deriving it from all powerful. Anywhere there is power playing out, anywhere there is cause and effect, there is knowledge to be learned about what, God's nature of how that power plays out, how that causality plays out, right? And how we relate to it and how we can have a deeper relationship and understanding of God, a deeper knowledge of God, so that we can continue that and we can use that wisdom through the rest of our life, I think.
Right. So now let's address the question of why it's important to understand that God knows everything. And actually, this is something that most people who believe in God accept, most Christians, Jews, Muslims, but it's important to go through this. In other words, like a lot of times, sometimes it's virtuous to be deceptive, to tell a falsehood, to tell a lie. In Judaism, sometimes we're called upon to not tell the truth, to save someone else hurt feelings, for the act of compassion. But other times we don't tell the truth because of some kind of self-interest. We're going to misrepresent something, hoping to gain something from it. Now, here's the thing, if we begin with the understanding that God knows everything, we're going to be tempted to sometimes it's, again, for the sake of our society and all, to not reveal everything about oneself and all, so we have our privacy, whatever. But when we're telling these lies sometimes that are for gain at the expense of others sometimes, and we understand that God is all knowing, omniscient, and that God is all powerful, we should probably understand, and this is another attribute we'll get to later, that if God is just, if God is judging us and rewarding us for the good we do and punishing us for the bad we do, then it's not like we're going to get away with anything. We might, in other words, the person that we're lying to may not understand our truth, and we might be able to have some kind of advantage over that person or group of people, but God will get us back. We'll talk about this law of karma. What goes around comes around. It's like we're not getting away with anything sometimes, and sometimes we can't connect the dots. A lot of people don't see the causal relationship, but Joshua, yeah, talk about how, like, it's important to understand and accept that God knows everything in terms of our virtue, in terms of, like, helping to motivate the best in us.
Yeah, George, I'm reminded of the phrase knowledge is power, right? So if we have knowledge about our behavior, about how the world works, about how our biology works, whatever it is, then we can use that as power to lead our virtue, to lead our actions, to lead our connections and our relationships, right? So I really like the second attribute, because if I say, well, I want to know, that about God's all powerfulness so that I can become all powerful, that's kind of egoic and prideful. But if I say, I want to know that God is all knowledgeable and knows all knowledge so that I can increase my own knowledge, just like we'd want to know about anybody who's smart, why we look up to Einstein or any great thinker, right? We're hoping some of that will rub off on us and we can also become more knowledgeable. And I think that's gets into a concept that a lot of people don't take take for granted about these attributes. One reason we focus on them and think about them is so that through our relationship with God and with these attributes, we can use them to guide our life and understanding.
Excellent. All right, now let's return to the derivations. If we are positing that God created everything, if we accept that there is a creation, and because of the creation and we're defining God as a creator, then the God has to exist, then, all right, God created everything, then that means that God created everything from God, because there was nothing to create everything from then God before, there was a creation, this Big Bang, this universe. So that means, like, if you're the creator, if God is the creator and God is everything, then how can one be the creator of everything and be everything and not know everything? So, like, again, this is another, God, if there is knowledge and God is everything, God is knowledge. And so if God is knowledge, all knowledge, then God must know everything. So again, this is another accurate definition of God. Now, we've gone through, like, it's accurate to define God as a creator. It's accurate to define God as all powerful. It's accurate to define God as omniscient. And again, this is talking to those who rely on their understanding of God according to faith or belief. This is another point of proof, point of evidence that we can understand God not because somebody 1,000 or 2,000 years ago said something, but we could logically deduce God's existence.
Yeah, certainly. I'm reminded how, as a left brain male who's stuck in my head a lot, thinking, or even, we see with mental illnesses that everybody kind of experiences a little bit, anxiety or, depression. This all comes from self-rumination and being stuck in our head with thoughts. And we have this, imaginative life that's kind of leading us astray or, isn't in touch with the real world and living in the real world, right? And so once we can re-engage with the world and interact with the world, with the everything in creation, then that's where we gain the most perspective, the most knowledge, right? And that's where we kind of gain the most happiness and insight. And so, if God created everything, then almost the knowledge is within those things that God created, right? And so for me, it makes sense, to also, when the power is playing out, when the causality is playing out, because of how nature interacts and how we interact with nature, then that kind of just ties it all in for me.
Yeah, you just got me thinking that, yeah, when we seek knowledge, when we obtain more knowledge, we're seeking God. You know, like if we know something, whatever it is, you know, we're knowing God better if God is all knowledge. Excellent. All right, so like, let's see what the next attribute. Again, this is the wiki page on God, you know, completely about God. So the next one is God being all present or omnipresent. Joshua, start us off with that one.
Now that's an interesting one. Again, it reminds me of the eternal attribute, and I'm not sure if that's the same thing or if all presence is, you know, included in eternal. Um, I guess how I relate to it, again, deriving it from the others and just going down the line, um, you know, if something is happening, you know, that's in time. It's occurring in time, in the present moment, right? And if I want to understand the present moment, if I want to understand how God is in that present moment, the knowledge of God, the creation of God, you know, all of it, then I have to realize, you know, that uh, God is omnipresent. He's not just present in the past where I've developed some knowledge about what may be happening now or in the future prediction, but happening now in the present. That allows me a lot of times, you know, if I'm fighting with somebody or I'm struggling with something, just to stop and check myself or check the runaway thoughts or check the runaway emotions and say, okay, this is God. You know, it may be bad, it may seem evil, but God is in it somewhere.
Excellent. Yeah, a lot of times when people understand God as being everywhere, they don't connect it to the correlate truth that God, if God is everywhere, God must be everything. And as you were explaining, that's an important truth for us to know, because like God is just not us. God is the people we relate to. God is people on other continents and other countries. God is, you know, to understand God as being everywhere and thus everything is to understand that we're all God. And that not only dignifies us, that not only, you know, makes it easier for us to see ourselves in a much higher form than just this lowly human being, you know, this separate from God, but it also allows us to relate to everything, not just people, but our surroundings, our apartment, you know, our city, wherever we live. It allows us to relate to everything as if we are relating to God, because that's the truth. We are relating to God. Now, in terms of the derivations, again, it's easy to understand how God defined as everything is an accurate definition, because if we start with God having been eternal, being eternal, and having existed before God created the world, again, if God was all that existed before this world, this, you know, 14 billion year old universe, then that's all God could have created the universe from. God created this universe from God. So God was everything there was before God created this universe. God continues to be everything there is within this universe. And presumably, you know, there could have been like gazillions of previous universes, and there may be gazillions of universes that follow this, but the same principle applies. God being eternal means that God is everything within every conceivable universe.
Yeah, George, you brought up a good point. This concept of if God's everything and God's everywhere and God's happening all the time, then does that mean we are God? And I struggle with that a lot. You know, I try to hold many forms of spirituality, um, even if they conflict in mind, in my head, in my spiritual practice at the same time. And the more fundamentalist conservative part of me has trouble with that, right? You know, if we look at Eastern religions, they very much kind of accept, they believe that's a core part of their spirituality. And we may want to talk about that as we segue from these other attributes to the next one of being omnibenevolent, being all good, because a lot of people feel so much shame or feel they're evil or they're wrong or you know, they've messed up so much. So how could they possibly be God? How could that possibly be true?
Yeah, and I think the answer is like, yes, fundamentalist religions, a lot of religions will object to this idea that we are the part of God that controls everything. In other words, like, you know, if we see our it's like that analogy with our hands. You know, our hands do things all the time, but it would be inaccurate to, even though our hands are part of us, it would be inaccurate to attribute any kind of control to the hand. Again, the hand is manifesting the will of the brain. So in that same way, yes, we are God. We are God because God is everything, God is everywhere. It's very important to understand that we're just not the part of God that is in control of everything, because if we see ourselves in that way, and religions get this, if we see ourselves in that way, we're being blasphemous and we're idolizing ourselves and each other. And that is not a good thing. So we have to attribute all power to God while appreciating and understanding that we are certainly part of God.
It's funny you bring up the hand issue, George. I'm fidgety today for some reason, and I find myself talking with my hands, but I'm trying to make eye contact with the camera, and I try to do that, and then all of a sudden I find myself talking with my hands down here, and then I'm looking at my hands because they're moving, and all of a sudden my hands are controlling my mind. It's funny. It's funny you brought that up, and you know, maybe that is, you know, in a way, my hands are a part of God. That's a different part of my brain. That's a part of God trying to tell me to keep eye contact with the camera and keep my hands still. And, you know, I mean, that's just a little funny example here with the camera and the show, but think about that in a situation where there's moral implications and judgment and shame, right? And all of a sudden, some part of your mind or your body is doing something that you might not be in control of. And, you know, but because the way we view God and we view ourselves and we view this free will issue, now all of a sudden we're blaming our whole selves. We're blaming our whole psyche, our whole identity. And that's making us more depressed, making us, you know, less likely to be open and honest and have, you know, sincere, loving relationships with each other. And I think, you know, that may have served a time in earlier religions, but we're evolving so fast, and you know, we've developed language in a ways that they didn't have, right? And understanding of the world and physics and science and psychology and biology. And so I think that's part of what we're doing with the show, is kind of bringing us up to speed and integrating it all, and hopefully, you know, make some sense and help people to develop these forms of spirituality that they haven't been exposed to before.
Excellent. So Josh, I mean, like, our next attribute we're going to explore is omnibenevolence. And that's relative to what we just explored. If God is everything, how can we not blame, you know, credit God for everything that happens well and blame God that, you know, for everything that doesn't happen well? That's a very complicated topic. We've got about 22 seconds left in this episode, but we're going to start the next episode by exploring why God is, we're going to make an argument for God being everything. Okay, thanks for omnibenevolent, all good. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you again on the next episode. Thanks.